The email arrived on a Tuesday morning, buried between spam about extended car warranties and notifications from social media platforms I hadn't used in years. No sender name, just a string of numbers where the address should be. The subject line read, "For your next story." I almost deleted it. Should have deleted it. Instead, I opened it and found 7 sets of coordinates, each followed by a single word: Nevada, Colorado, Montana. At the bottom, a message that made my journalist instincts perk up. The deeper you go, the more they remember. My name is David Keller, and I make a living writing about the forgotten places of America. Abandoned buildings, ghost towns, industrial ruins, the remnants of dreams that didn't pan out. It's not glamorous work, but it pays the bills and gives me an excuse to travel. After my divorce 6 months ago, traveling felt more like necessity than choice. The coordinates intrigued me. I plugged them into Google Maps and found they corresponded to abandoned mining operations scattered across the western United States. A quick search revealed these weren't tourist destinations or well-documented historical sites. These were the forgotten mines, the ones that closed quietly and were left to decay in remote locations far from major highways. Perfect for the kind of article series I specialized in. I packed my gear, camera, flashlights, emergency supplies, and enough food for a week, and headed west from my apartment in Chicago. The first coordinates led me to Nevada, to a place called Copper Ridge. Copper Ridge, Nevada. The drive took me through increasingly desolate country. Towns became settlements, settlements became truck stops, and eventually even the truck stops disappeared. The GPS guided me down a dirt road that wound through hills covered in sagebrush and scattered with the bleached bones of long dead animals. The mine sat in a depression between 2 hills, invisible until you were almost on top of it. A collection of weathered wooden buildings surrounded the entrance to a tunnel that disappeared into the mountainside. Rusted mining equipment lay scattered around the site like the discarded toys of giants. A sign hanging by one corner read, "Copper Ridge Mine, established, 1923. I parked next to what had once been the main office building and walked over to examine the mine entrance. The tunnel mouth was secured with a heavy metal grate, but time and weather had warped the bars enough to create gaps large enough for a person to squeeze through. Someone had been here recently. Fresh tire tracks marked the dirt, and I found an empty energy drink can that couldn't have been more than a few days old. Before exploring, I drove back to the nearest town, a cluster of mobile homes, and a single business called Helen's Diner. The owner, a woman in her 60s with steel grey hair, looked up from wiping down tables when I entered. "You heading to the mine?" she asked without preamble. I nodded, surprised. "How did you know?" Same reason they all come through here. Young men with cameras and backpacks, asking about the old copper operation. Helen's eyes were sharp, studying me with the intensity of someone who'd seen too much. "You should know, there's sounds that come from underground. Sounds that ain't natural." "What kind of sounds?" She shrugged and went back to cleaning. "The kind that make you wish you'd stayed home." I ordered coffee and a sandwich, hoping to draw out more information. But Helen had apparently said all she intended to say. She served my food in silence and busied herself with cleaning tasks that didn't need doing. Back at the mine, I squeezed through the gap in the grate and clicked on my headlamp. The tunnel stretched ahead, supported by wooden beams that creaked ominously in the slight breeze. The air smelled of earth and something else, something organic and unpleasant that I couldn't identify. I followed the main tunnel for about 100 yards before it branched into 3 separate passages. The leftmost passage was blocked by a cave-in, but the other 2 continued into darkness. I chose the middle tunnel and found myself in what had clearly been the main working area of the mine. Rusted rail tracks ran along the floor, and side passages branched off every 30 feet or so. That's when I heard the first voice. It was barely a whisper, so faint I almost convinced myself it was just the wind moving through the tunnels. But as I stood still and listened, I could make out words, or what sounded like words, names spoken in a tone that might have been pleading or calling. Robert, Thomas, come back. The voices seemed to come from deeper in the mine, from passages that led further underground. I followed the sound, taking photographs as I went, documenting the decay and abandonment that filled every corner of the place. But the deeper I went, the more the voices seemed to multiply. Not louder, but more numerous, as if a crowd of people were whispering just beyond the range of my hearing. I found the office about 300 yards into the mine, in a side chamber that had been carved out of the rock. A wooden desk sat in the center, covered with papers that should have crumbled to dust decades ago, but were instead remarkably well preserved. Mining charts, work schedules, and in the center of the desk, a leather-bound guest registry book. I opened the book, expecting blank pages or entries from the 1920s. Instead, I found entries that went back years, but not decades. The handwriting was modern, the dates recent. Someone had been maintaining this registry, and visitors had been signing in regularly. The last entry was from 3 days ago. Thomas Brennan, Level 4. They're waiting. I flipped through more pages and found dozens of names, all with dates from the past few years. Some visitors had made multiple entries, returning to the mine again and again. Others appeared only once. All of them mentioned going deeper to Level 2, Level 3, and some as far as Level 6. But according to the historical records I'd researched, the Copper Ridge mine had never been more than 2 levels deep. I photographed the registry and made my way back to the surface, the whispered voices following me until I emerged into the fading daylight. As I drove away from the mine, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that eyes were following me from the dark mouth of the tunnel. That night, in a motel room in the next town over, I plotted the remaining coordinates on my map. They formed a rough line across Nevada, Colorado, and Montana, connected by interstate highways and back roads. Someone had planned this route carefully, and I was beginning to suspect that the anonymous email hadn't been random. I was meant to follow this trail. Iron Creek, Colorado. The second mine was different from the first in every way except one: the feeling that I was expected. Iron Creek had been a massive operation, carved into the side of a mountain in Colorado's high country. The main building was 3 stories tall, built of stone and steel that had withstood decades of mountain weather. This wasn't a small-time operation like Copper Ridge. This had been serious mining, the kind that employed hundreds of men and moved millions of tons of ore. I stopped at a gas station in the nearest town and struck up a conversation with an elderly man filling up an ancient pickup truck. When I mentioned Iron Creek, his expression grew serious. "You Roy's grandson?" he asked. "No, I'm a journalist, writing about abandoned mining operations." The old man, he introduced himself as Roy, shook his head slowly. "My grandfather worked that mine until the accident in '63. Lost 17 men in the deep shafts. They could hear 'em calling from underground for weeks afterward. But when the rescue teams finally got through, they never found the bodies." Roy agreed to drive up to the mine with me, partly out of curiosity and partly, I suspected, to make sure I didn't do anything foolish. The road to Iron Creek was better maintained than the one to Copper Ridge, winding through pine forests that gave way to bare rock as we climbed higher. "There," Roy pointed as we rounded a curve. "Iron Creek Mine." The operation was enormous. Buildings covered several acres, connected by elevated walkways and conveyor systems. The main mine entrance was a gaping hole in the mountainside, easily large enough to drive a truck through. Everything was built on an industrial scale, designed to extract ore from deep in the earth and process it on site. "How deep did they dig?" I asked as we parked near the main building. "Official records say 8 levels," Roy replied, "but my grandfather always claimed they went deeper. Said there were passages down there that weren't on any map." We entered through a side door that hung open on broken hinges. The interior was a maze of offices, equipment rooms, and storage areas. Everything was covered in decades of dust and debris, but like the Copper Ridge mine, there were signs of recent visitors. Fresh footprints in the dust, modern trash, and on a bulletin board in what had been the supervisor's office, a hand-drawn map showing the layout of the mine's levels. Someone had added notations to the map in red ink. Level 3, personal items. Level 5, the chamber. And at the very bottom, Level 7, they're all here. "That ain't right," Roy said, studying the map. "Mine never went past Level 6. We found the elevator shaft in the center of the main building. The elevator car was long gone, but cables still hung down into the darkness. A ladder had been bolted to the shaft wall, disappearing down into blackness. "I ain't going down there," Roy announced. "Haven't set foot in this mine since I was a boy, and I ain't starting now." I didn't blame him. The shaft seemed to exhale cold, stale air that smelled of deep earth and something else, something that made my skin crawl. But the journalist in me couldn't resist. I'd come this far, and the story was just beginning to unfold. I climbed down to Level 1, then Level 2, photographing everything. The deeper I went, the more I could hear them, the voices that had followed me from Nevada. They were clearer here, more distinct. I could make out individual words, names, fragments of conversation that seemed to drift up from even deeper levels. Level 3 was where I found the first collection. Someone had arranged personal belongings throughout the level's main chamber. Lunchboxes sat open on wooden crates, their contents long since spoiled and dried to dust. Photographs were propped against the stone walls, pictures of families, children, groups of miners posing outside the very building I'd just descended from. Work boots were lined up in neat rows, as if their owners had just stepped out of them moments ago. Everything was covered in dust, but the arrangement was too deliberate to be accidental. Someone had collected these items and displayed them here in the depths of an abandoned mine like a museum exhibit of lives interrupted. The voices were stronger here, coming from passages that led deeper into the mountain. I could hear them calling names, some that matched the names on the photographs scattered around the chamber. And underneath those voices, barely audible, I heard my own name being whispered in the darkness. David, David, come deeper. I retreated to level 2, then level 1, climbing the ladder as fast as my shaking legs would carry me. Roy was waiting for me at the surface, smoking a cigarette and looking anxious. You look like you've seen a ghost, he said. I didn't answer. I couldn't explain what I'd seen down there. The careful arrangement of belongings, the voices calling my name. Instead, I thanked Roy for his help and drove back to town, checking into another motel room where I lay awake all night, staring at the ceiling and trying to convince myself that what I'd experienced had a rational explanation. But I knew I was going to continue to the next mine. I had to. Something was drawing me forward, pulling me deeper into whatever mystery connected these abandoned places. Devil's Canyon, Colorado. The third mine was different. While Copper Ridge had felt abandoned and Iron Creek had felt empty, Devil's Canyon felt actively malevolent. The mine sat at the end of a box canyon, accessible only by a single dirt road that wound through increasingly hostile terrain. The buildings were smaller than Iron Creek's, but older than Copper Ridge's, built of local stone that blended into the canyon walls. A sign at the entrance, weathered and bullet-holed, read Devil's Canyon Silver Mine, established 1899. I'd done my research this time. The local library in the nearest town had provided newspaper clippings about Devil's Canyon dating back to its opening. The mine had a dark history even before the accident that closed it. Betty, the librarian, had been helpful in a way that made me suspicious. She'd pulled the relevant files too quickly, as if she'd been preparing for my visit. The newspapers told a story of poor safety conditions, labor disputes, and a series of accidents that culminated in the cave-in of 1948 that trapped 12 miners in the deep shafts. They could hear them for days, Betty had said, reading from a yellowed newspaper. The rescue teams worked around the clock, but when they finally broke through to where the men were trapped, they didn't find any bodies. The official report said the bodies must have been swept away by an underground river, but the miners' families never accepted that explanation. The newspaper included interviews with the rescue team leader, who'd insisted that the voices they'd heard calling for help from underground had continued even after they'd broken through to the trapped area. The voices had grown fainter over the following weeks, but never completely stopped. Some folks say you can still hear them, Betty had added quietly. On quiet nights, when the wind is right, voices calling from deep in Devil's Canyon. I'd thanked her for the information and driven out to see for myself. The mine entrance was partially blocked by what appeared to be the remnants of the 1948 cave-in, a pile of boulders and broken timber that filled the lower half of the tunnel mouth. But someone had cleared a path through the debris, creating a narrow passage that led deeper into the mine. The passage was tight, forcing me to crawl on my hands and knees for the first 50 yards. When it finally opened up, I found myself in a chamber that wasn't on any of the mine diagrams I'd studied. This was older construction, carved from the rock with tools that predated the industrial equipment used in the other areas of the mine. The voices were immediate and overwhelming. Not whispers this time, but clear, distinct calls for help that seemed to come from all directions at once. I could hear individual voices, men calling to each other, shouting warnings, crying out in pain and fear. It sounded like I was listening to the actual cave-in of 1948, as if the sounds had been trapped in the rock for 70 years. But underneath those voices, I heard something else. Responses. Other voices answering the calls for help. But these weren't the voices of rescue workers. These voices were calling the trapped miners by name, encouraging them to go deeper, to follow the sound into passages that led away from the surface. I followed a tunnel that sloped downward at a steep angle, my headlamp beam revealing rough-hewn walls that narrowed and widened without pattern. The voices grew stronger as I descended, and I began to make out individual conversations. "This way, Thomas. The way out is deeper. Follow the sound, Robert. We're waiting. Don't go back up, David. Stay with us." That last voice stopped me cold. I stood perfectly still in the narrow tunnel, listening to the echoes fade into silence. Then, from deeper in the mine, I heard my name again. "David, we've been waiting for you. Come deeper." I reached a chamber that took my breath away. It was enormous, a natural cavern that the miners had discovered and incorporated into their operation. But the impressive size wasn't what made me gasp. It was what filled the chamber. The belongings of the 12 miners who died in 1948 were arranged in a perfect circle around what appeared to be a natural sinkhole in the chamber floor. Their lunch pails, work clothes, tools, and personal effects were laid out as if they'd been carefully preserved and displayed. In the center of the circle, photographs of the miners were arranged around the edge of the sinkhole, facing inward toward the darkness below. The sinkhole was perfectly round, about 10 feet in diameter, and so deep that my headlamp beam couldn't reach the bottom. But I could hear sounds coming from it, voices, movement, and underneath it all, a sound like breathing, as if something enormous was sleeping far below. The voices were coming from the sinkhole, not echoes or acoustic tricks, but actual voices calling up from whatever lay at the bottom of that shaft. And they were calling my name with increasing frequency and urgency. "David, come down to us. It's better here. You don't have to be alone anymore." I backed away from the chamber and made my way to the surface as quickly as I could manage. But even as I drove away from Devil's Canyon, speeding down the dirt road as fast as my car could handle, I could still hear the voices calling my name. That night, I sat in another motel room and tried to make sense of what I was experiencing. 3 mines, 3 different locations, but all connected by the same impossible phenomenon. Voices calling from deep underground, personal belongings arranged as if their owners had just stepped away, and an overwhelming compulsion to go deeper into each mine. I should have driven home, should have abandoned the story and returned to Chicago. But I couldn't. Something was pulling me forward, drawing me toward the remaining coordinates. I had to see where this trail led, had to understand what connected these places. The next morning, I continued north toward Montana. Goldbrook, Montana. Montana felt different from the moment I crossed the state line. The sky seemed bigger, the horizons more distant, and the abandoned mines more isolated. Goldbrook was located in a valley that appeared on few maps and was accessible only by a single mountain road that showed signs of recent maintenance, despite leading to an officially abandoned site. I stopped at a truck stop about 50 miles from the mine and met Jim, a former mine safety inspector who'd been tracking incidents at abandoned mining sites across the western states for the past 20 years. Jim was in his 60s, methodical and precise in his speech, and he knew more about the mines I'd been visiting than their official histories contained. "You're following the route," he said when I described my journey. "Same path they all take. Young men, usually traveling alone, visiting these specific sites in this exact order." Jim showed me a notebook filled with names and dates. Thomas Brennan, whose name I'd seen in the Copper Ridge Registry, was there, along with dozens of others spanning the past 2 decades. "They disappear," Jim explained, "not all at once, and not always at the same mine, but they follow this route, and eventually they don't come back. Their families report them missing, search teams find their vehicles, but the men themselves are never found. What do you think happens to them?" Jim was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the Montana landscape. "I think these mines are connected, not just by the roads that lead to them, but by something underground, something that's been down there a lot longer than any mining operation." He agreed to accompany me to Goldbrook, partly for research purposes and partly because he was concerned about me traveling alone. The road to the mine wound through forests of pine and aspen, climbing steadily until we reached a plateau where the Goldbrook mine spread across several acres of mountain meadow. This had been the most successful of all the operations I'd visited. Gold mining had continued here into the 1970s, and the equipment was correspondingly more modern. But like the others, it showed signs of recent activity, despite being officially closed for decades. The main shaft was enormous, large enough for industrial elevators that could carry equipment and dozens of workers at once. According to the site maps, the mine extended nearly a mile underground, with dozens of levels and hundreds of individual chambers. "Deepest mine in this part of Montana," Jim said as we examined the elevator shaft. They followed the gold veins down into geological formations that shouldn't exist at this latitude. We descended to level 3 using the maintenance ladder that had been installed along the shaft wall. The mine was a maze of tunnels and chambers, each level connected to the next by a network of shafts and passages that seemed to have been dug according to no rational plan. On level 5, we found evidence that someone had been living in the mine recently. Sleeping bags, camp stoves, and food supplies were arranged in one of the larger chambers. Jim examined the supplies and determined they'd been there for several months. "Whoever was staying here left in a hurry," he observed, pointing to personal belongings scattered around the chamber. "But look at this." He led me to a side passage where someone had carved messages into the rock wall. Most were names and dates, but some were longer messages. "The voices are real. TB 2019. Don't go to level 7. They're waiting there. David, if you're reading this, turn back now." That last message made my blood run cold. It was carved in fresh letters, the rock dust still white and sharp. Someone had carved my name into the wall recently, knowing I would find it. "Thomas Brennan," Jim said. reading the initials next to one of the messages. He was one of the ones I tracked. Disappeared about 2 years ago while exploring these mines. We found Brennan's journal in a side chamber on level 6. The entries detailed his exploration of the same mines I'd been visiting, following the same route, experiencing the same phenomena. But his final entries revealed something that made my hands shake as I read them. Day 47. The voices are getting stronger. They know my name, my history, things about my life that no one should know. They're calling me to go deeper, to level 7 and below. I know I should leave, drive back to Denver and forget about this whole thing. But I can't. Something is compelling me to continue, to see where this leads. Day 52. Found the connection today. The mines aren't separate operations. They're all access points to the same underground system, a network of natural caves that extends across hundreds of miles. The mining companies didn't dig these tunnels. They found them and built their operations around them. Day 58. I understand now. The mines were never abandoned. They were transformed. The people who disappear don't die. They join something that's been waiting underground for a very long time. And now it's my turn. If someone finds this journal, if someone named David comes looking for answers, tell him to turn back. The voices are calling, and I can't resist them anymore. The journal ended there, but clipped to the back cover was a hand-drawn map showing the layout of level 7 and below. According to Brennan's map, the mine extended much deeper than any official records indicated, connecting to a vast network of natural caverns that stretched underground for miles in every direction. Jim and I retreated to level 5, then to the surface, but the damage was done. I could hear them now, the voices calling from deep in the mine, calling my name with an urgency that made my chest tight and my breathing difficult. You need to leave, Jim said as we reached the surface. Drive back to Chicago tonight. Don't stop, don't look back, and don't visit any more of these places. But I couldn't. Even as Jim spoke, I could feel the pull of the remaining coordinates, the need to continue the journey and see where it led. Something was drawing me forward, something that had been drawing others for years. I thanked Jim for his help and drove away from Goldbrook as the sun set behind the mountains. But instead of heading east toward home, I turned north toward the next coordinate. Ashford, Montana. The 5th mine was the largest I'd encountered, a massive coal mining operation that covered an entire mountainside. The buildings were built of brick and steel, designed to last for generations of mining activity. This wasn't a small-time operation or even a large commercial venture. This was industrial mining on a scale that dwarfed everything I'd seen before. But like the others, Ashford showed signs of recent activity despite being officially closed since 1982. I met Frank in the town nearest to the mine, a collection of abandoned buildings that had once housed the miners and their families. Frank was about my age, a former software engineer who'd left his job 2 years ago to search for his brother, who disappeared while exploring these same mines. Danny was following the same route you are, Frank explained as we drove up to the mine. Same coordinates, same mysterious email. He'd call me from each location, more excited with each mine he visited. Then he reached Ashford, and the call stopped. Frank had spent the past 2 years investigating his brother's disappearance, and had discovered connections between the mines that went far beyond what any official records contained. According to his research, the mining operations had been built over a natural cave system that extended across 3 states, connecting all of the mines through underground passages. The companies knew, Frank said as we parked outside the main building. They had geological surveys going back to the 1800s that showed the cave systems, but they built the mines anyway, using the natural passages to extend their operations much deeper than would have been possible otherwise. The main elevator shaft at Ashford was enormous, large enough to move trainloads of coal from the deep levels to the surface. We descended using a maintenance cage that Frank had learned to operate during his search for his brother. Level 3 was where the industrial mining gave way to something else. The passages here were older, carved from the rock with hand tools rather than machinery. The walls were covered with symbols and markings that predated any of the mining operations. Native American? I asked, examining the carvings. Frank shook his head. Older. Much older. Some of these symbols appear in archaeological sites that date back thousands of years. We found Danny's belongings on level 7, arranged in a small chamber alongside the belongings of dozens of other people. Backpacks, cameras, personal items, all laid out as if their owners had carefully arranged them before moving on to something else. But it was what Frank found next that changed everything. In a side passage, he discovered a journal that had belonged to one of the original mine surveyors from 1923. The surveyor had documented his exploration of the natural cave systems beneath the mining claims, and his entries revealed the truth about what lay underground. The caves were inhabited, not by animals or natural formations, but by people who'd been living underground for generations, possibly centuries. The mining operations hadn't disturbed them. They'd provided access to the surface world that the underground dwellers had been seeking. They're not dead, Frank said, reading from the journal. The people who disappear, they're not killed or lost. They're recruited. The underground community has been growing for generations, bringing down surface dwellers to join their society. The journal described encounters with the underground dwellers who appeared normal at first glance, but had been changed by their years in the deep caves. They spoke of a better way of life, free from the chaos and conflict of the surface world. They offered community, purpose, and belonging to those who felt lost or alone in the world above. Danny never felt like he fit in up here, Frank said quietly. After his divorce, after losing his job, he was looking for something, a place where he belonged. We continued deeper into the mine, following passages that led into natural cave systems that stretched far beyond the boundaries of the mining operation. The voices were constant now, no longer whispers but clear conversations coming from chambers just ahead of us. On level 9, we found the community. They were waiting for us in a vast natural cavern that had been converted into a living space. Dozens of people, ranging in age from teenagers to elderly men and women, all dressed in simple clothing that looked like it had been made by hand. They moved with purpose and coordination that suggested they'd been working together for a long time. Among them was Danny, Frank's brother, who greeted us with a smile that was both welcoming and somehow wrong. "Frank," Danny said, approaching his brother with open arms. I knew you'd find your way down here eventually. And David, we've been waiting for you specifically." The community surrounded us, not threatening but insistent. They spoke of the surface world with pity and disdain, describing it as a place of suffering and isolation that they'd left behind. Underground, they explained, life was simpler, more connected, more meaningful. "No more loneliness," a woman said, taking my arm with surprising strength. "No more searching for purpose. Down here, everyone belongs." They showed us their living areas, carved from the rock and furnished with items that looked like they'd been collected from the surface over many years. Gardens grew in chambers lit by reflected sunlight, channeled down from the surface through a system of mirrors and crystals. Workshop areas contained tools and equipment for maintaining their underground society. It was impressive, even beautiful in its own way. But there was something fundamentally wrong with the people themselves. They moved too smoothly, spoke too uniformly, and their eyes reflected light in a way that human eyes shouldn't. "The transformation takes time," Danny explained, noticing my stare. "The underground changes you, makes you better adapted to life down here, more connected to the community, less burdened by individual concerns." Frank was backing toward the passage we'd entered through, but several community members had positioned themselves to block our retreat. We were surrounded, and they were making it clear that leaving wasn't an option they intended to offer us. "Your brother understands," Danny continued, speaking to Frank but looking at me. "He came here looking for something, and he found it. Purpose, community, belonging. Everything the surface world failed to provide." "Danny, we need to go," Frank said, his voice tight with fear. "Mom's been worried sick. Everyone thinks you're dead." Danny's expression grew sad, but not in a way that looked entirely human. "I am dead to that world, Frank. We all are. But down here, we're more alive than we ever were on the surface." The community began to close in around us, their movements coordinated and purposeful. They spoke in soft, encouraging tones about the benefits of joining them, about leaving behind the pain and isolation of surface life, about becoming part of something larger and more meaningful. I realized we were looking at the end of the trail that had begun with those mysterious coordinates. Every mine had been leading us here to this underground community that collected the lost and lonely and transformed them into something else. Frank made a break for the passage, pushing past the community members who tried to stop him. I followed, running through the tunnels as fast as I could manage while the voices echoed behind us, calling our names, pleading with us to return. We reached the elevator shaft and climbed toward the surface as quickly as our shaking legs would carry us. Behind us, the voices grew fainter, but never completely faded. Even when we reached the surface and ran to our vehicles, I could still hear them calling from deep underground. Frank drove east that night, heading back to his old life with a brother he'd never see again. But I couldn't leave. Not yet. There were still 2 coordinates left, and I had to know where the trail ended. Pine Valley, Montana. The 6th mine felt different from the moment I arrived. While the others had felt abandoned or transformed, Pine Valley felt ancient. The buildings were constructed in a style I didn't recognize, built from stones that seemed to have been shaped by tools that predated modern construction techniques. According to the official records, Pine Valley had been opened in 1955 as a silver mining operation. but standing at the site, looking at the weathered buildings and the entrance carved into the mountainside, I knew those records were wrong. This place was much older than any mid-20th century mining venture. The elevator shaft descended much deeper than it should have, given the size of the surface operations. I rode the maintenance cage down past level after level, each one carved from the rock with increasing sophistication, until I reached depths that shouldn't have been possible for a silver mining operation. At level 12, I found proof that Pine Valley predated all the other mining operations by decades, possibly centuries. The passages here were lined with stones carved with symbols similar to those I'd seen at Ashford, but more elaborate and extensive. These weren't the markings of miners or industrial workers. These were the work of people who had been living underground for generations. The voices were different here too. Instead of the calling and pleading I'd experienced at the other mines, here I heard conversations, laughter, the sounds of a community going about their daily activities. It was coming from deeper levels, from chambers that lay far below even the extensive mining operations. I found the truth on level 15, in a chamber that had clearly been used as some kind of meeting or ceremonial space. The walls were covered with paintings that told a story spanning centuries. They showed people descending into the earth, not as miners or workers, but as pilgrims seeking something that could only be found in the deep places of the world. The paintings depicted the growth of the underground community over generations. They showed surface dwellers being welcomed into the depths, being transformed by their time underground, and eventually becoming part of something larger and more connected than anything possible on the surface. But they also showed something else. The community wasn't static. It was growing, expanding, reaching up toward the surface through the mining operations that provided access to their domain. The mines weren't abandoned industrial sites. They were recruitment centers, carefully maintained to draw in specific types of people who would be suitable for transformation. People like me. In the final chamber, I found belongings from every person who had disappeared while following the route of coordinates. Backpacks, cameras, personal items, journals, all arranged in a vast circle around a natural opening in the chamber floor. The opening was large enough to walk through, and a carved stairway descended into darkness beyond the reach of any light. The voices were coming from below, not calling or pleading now, but welcoming. They knew I was there, knew I had followed the trail to its intended destination. They had been preparing for my arrival, just as they had prepared for all the others. I understood now that the anonymous email, the coordinates, the compulsion to continue from mine to mine, none of it had been accidental. The underground community had been recruiting for generations, using different methods for different eras. In recent decades, they had adapted to modern technology, using email and GPS coordinates to guide suitable candidates along a carefully planned route. The route was designed to gradually introduce surface dwellers to the reality of the underground community. Each mine revealed a little more, prepared visitors for what they would eventually find. By the time someone reached Pine Valley, they were psychologically ready to accept what was being offered: a life underground, a community that would never abandon or reject them. purpose and belonging in exchange for leaving the surface world behind forever. I stood at the edge of the opening, listening to the voices calling up from below, and realized I had to make a choice. I could turn around, climb back to the surface, and try to return to my old life. But the community would never stop calling, never stop drawing me back. I would spend the rest of my life hearing those voices, feeling the pull of the coordinates, knowing that there was a place where I truly belonged. Or I could descend the carved stairs and join the community that had been waiting for me. The voices grew more insistent, more welcoming. They spoke of the others who had come before me, of the life that waited below, of the transformation that would make me part of something greater than I could imagine on the surface. I took a step toward the opening, then another. The carved stairs were worn smooth by countless feet over what must have been centuries of use. As I descended, the voices grew clearer, more individual. I could hear Thomas Brennan, whose name I'd seen in that first registry book. I could hear Danny, Frank's brother, calling my name with genuine warmth and excitement. But I also heard something else, a sound like breathing, deep and rhythmic, coming from far below, something massive and ancient that existed at the heart of this underground world. 20 steps down, 50 steps, 100. The stairway spiraled deeper into the earth, carved from living rock that seemed to pulse with its own warmth. The voices surrounded me now, no longer coming from below, but from all directions, as if the rock itself was speaking. I stopped. Something was wrong, not with the community, or the voices, or even the impossible depth of the stairway. Something was wrong with me. I was walking willingly into a situation that my rational mind knew was dangerous, possibly fatal. But I couldn't seem to stop myself. The compulsion that had driven me from mine to mine, that had kept me moving forward despite every warning sign, wasn't curiosity or professional dedication. It was something external, something that had been influencing my decisions from the moment I'd opened that anonymous email. I thought about Frank, who had managed to resist the pull long enough to escape from Ashford. I thought about Jim, the mine inspector, who had spent 20 years investigating these disappearances without being drawn in himself. They had something I lacked, a reason to resist, a connection to the surface world that was stronger than whatever was calling from below. I had nothing waiting for me above, no family, no close friends, no job that couldn't be done by someone else. I was exactly the kind of person the underground community targeted, isolated, searching for purpose, vulnerable to the promise of belonging somewhere. But knowing that didn't make the pull any weaker. If anything, understanding my own vulnerability made the voices more persuasive. They offered everything I lacked: community, purpose, belonging, transformation into something better than I could become on my own. I took another step down the carved stairway, then another. The breathing sound grew louder, more distinct. Something vast and patient was waiting at the bottom of this descent, something that had been calling to surface dwellers for generations. Suddenly, I heard a new voice, my own voice, echoing up from the depths below. But it wasn't my voice as I knew it. It was my voice as it would become after the transformation, welcoming the next lost soul who would follow the coordinates to this place. David, my transformed voice called from the darkness below. Don't be afraid. It's better here. You'll never be alone again. That stopped me cold. I was listening to my own future, to what I would become if I continued down these stairs. I would join the underground community, undergo whatever transformation had changed Danny and Thomas Brennan and all the others, and eventually I would help them recruit the next batch of surface dwellers who received mysterious coordinates in their email. I turned around and began climbing back up the stairway. The voices followed me, no longer welcoming but desperate, pleading. They called my name with increasing urgency, promising things they couldn't possibly deliver, threatening consequences they couldn't enforce from the depths of their underground world. But I kept climbing. It took me 3 hours to reach the surface. 3 hours of climbing while voices called from below, while the breathing sound grew fainter but never completely disappeared, while part of my mind insisted that I was making a terrible mistake. When I finally emerged into the daylight, Pine Valley looked different. The buildings seemed less substantial, as if they were facades, hiding something much older and more sinister. The entrance to the mine exhaled cold air that carried the sound of distant voices, even in the bright afternoon sunlight. I drove away from Pine Valley as fast as my car would carry me, but I knew I wasn't free. Not yet. There was still one more coordinate, one final destination on the route that had been planned for me. The 7th mine. The final coordinate led me to a place that didn't appear on any map. I followed my GPS through increasingly remote country, down roads that seemed to exist only temporarily, shifting and changing each time I glanced at them in my mirrors. The landscape itself felt unstable, as if reality was becoming less reliable the closer I got to my destination. The mine sat in a valley that shouldn't have existed, surrounded by mountains that cast shadows in directions that defied the position of the sun. The entrance was older than any of the others, carved from rock by methods that predated not just modern mining techniques, but possibly any known construction technology. There were no buildings here, no industrial equipment, no signs of commercial mining operations. Just the entrance to a tunnel that disappeared into the mountain, and a wooden sign so weathered that I could barely make out the carved letters. Welcome home. I knew I shouldn't enter. Everything I'd learned at the other mines, every warning I'd received, every rational thought in my mind told me to turn around and drive away. But I also knew I couldn't. This was where the trail ended, where all the coordinates had been leading me. If I didn't see what waited in this final mine, I would spend the rest of my life wandering, being called back by voices that would never stop. The tunnel was different from the others. Instead of the rough-hewn passages of industrial mining or the carved chambers of the underground community, this tunnel felt organic, as if it had been grown rather than dug. The walls curved smoothly, and the floor sloped downward at a gentle but consistent angle. There were no side passages, no levels, no complexity, just a single tunnel that spiraled deeper and deeper into the earth, lit by a phosphorescent glow that seemed to come from the rock itself. I walked for what felt like hours, following the spiral path as it descended through layers of rock that should have taken millions of years to form, but seemed to have been shaped by some more immediate and purposeful force. The breathing sound I'd heard at Pine Valley was constant here, coming not from ahead or behind, but from all around me, as if the tunnel itself was alive and breathing. The walls pulsed gently with each breath, and the phosphorescent glow brightened and dimmed in rhythm with the sound. Eventually, the tunnel opened into a chamber so vast that my eyes couldn't find its boundaries. The phosphorescent glow was brighter here, revealing glimpses of structures and formations that hurt to look at directly. This wasn't a mine or even a cave in any conventional sense. This was something else entirely, something that existed according to rules that didn't apply to the surface world. At the center of the chamber, I found them. Every person who had disappeared while following the coordinates was there, standing in concentric circles around something that sat at the very heart of the space. They looked exactly as they had in life. Thomas Brennan, Danny, dozens of others spanning decades of disappearances. But their eyes reflected the phosphorescent glow, and when they moved with perfect coordination, as if controlled by a single will. "David," Thomas Brennan spoke, but his voice carried harmonics that no human throat could produce. "You're the last one. We've been waiting for you to complete the circle." I looked at what they surrounded and finally understood what had been calling to surface dwellers for generations. It wasn't human. It had never been human. It was something ancient and patient and utterly alien that had been sleeping beneath the mountains for geological ages. The mining operations had been attempts to reach it, to establish communication with something that existed far below the deepest human excavations. And it had been successful. Over the decades, it had learned to communicate with the surface world, to send out signals that would attract the kind of people who could serve its purposes. The disappeared hadn't joined an underground community. They had become extensions of something that needed human agents to interact with the surface world. "You'll be the last," Danny said, his voice carrying the same impossible harmonics. "After you, we won't need to call anyone else down. We'll be complete." The thing at the center of the chamber pulsed with a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. It was beautiful in a way that made my eyes water and my mind struggle to process what I was seeing. It offered everything the voices had promised: belonging, purpose, transformation into something greater than human. But I finally understood what that transformation really meant. "No," I said, backing toward the tunnel entrance. The circle of transformed humans turned toward me with perfect synchronization. Their faces showed disappointment, but not surprise, as if they had expected this moment of resistance. "You can't leave," Thomas Brennan said. "You've seen too much, you know too much, and you have nowhere to go on the surface. No one who would miss you, no one who would believe you if you tried to tell them what you found." He was right. I had no family, few friends, no connection strong enough to anchor me to the surface world. I was exactly the kind of person this thing had been designed to attract: isolated, searching, vulnerable. But I had something the others hadn't possessed when they'd reached this point. I had their example. I had seen what the transformation really meant, seen the price of the belonging and purpose that was being offered. I ran. The tunnel felt longer on the way out, stretching endlessly upward while the breathing sound grew louder behind me. The phosphorescent glow dimmed as I climbed, but I could hear them following. Not just the transformed humans, but something larger, something that moved through the rock itself like water. The entrance to the mine was shrinking as I approached it. the opening growing smaller with each step I took toward the surface. I dove through the gap just as it contracted to the size of a fist, rolling onto the ground outside as the entrance sealed itself completely. The valley was changing around me. The impossible mountains were shifting, the shadows moving in directions that defied physics, and my car was no longer where I had parked it. I was stranded in a place that shouldn't exist, that was rapidly becoming less real with each passing moment. But I could see a road in the distance, a normal highway that looked like it belonged to the actual world rather than this nightmare landscape. I ran toward it, not looking back as the valley collapsed into itself behind me. Epilogue. I'm writing this in a motel room in Idaho, 3 states away from where this all began. It's been 6 months since I escaped from that final mine, and I've been moving constantly ever since. Not because I'm being pursued, at least not physically, but because I can't stay in one place long enough for them to find me. The voices still call to me, not from underground now, but from electronics, my phone, my laptop, the radio in whatever car I'm driving. They use different frequencies, different channels, but they're always there, whispering coordinates to new locations, promising that this time will be different. I don't know if what I experienced was real in any objective sense. I don't know if those minds actually exist, or if I've been suffering from some kind of prolonged psychological breakdown. I don't know if Thomas Brennan and Danny and all the others are really trapped in an underground chamber serving something ancient and alien, or if they simply never existed at all. What I do know is that I can't go back to my old life. The person who received that first anonymous email no longer exists. I've been changed by what I saw, what I experienced, what I barely escaped from. I moved from place to place, taking odd jobs, avoiding anything that might connect me to the internet long enough for them to track my location. Because they are looking for me. I know they're looking for me. The thing at the center of that final chamber needs its circle to be complete, and I was supposed to be the final piece. Without me, it remains incomplete, unable to achieve whatever purpose it has been working toward for generations. Sometimes I wonder if I should have stayed, if I should have accepted the transformation and joined the others in their perfect, coordinated existence. It would have been easier than this constant running, this persistent fear, this knowledge that I will never be safe no matter how far I travel. But then I remember the way they moved, all of them together, controlled by something that was definitely not human. I remember the breathing sound and the phosphorescent glow and the thing at the center that was beautiful and terrible and absolutely alien. I made the right choice, even if it means I'll spend the rest of my life running from coordinates that whisper to me through radio static and electronic interference. Even if it means I'll never be able to stop moving, never be able to trust that any place is safe for more than a few days. Even if it means I'll always be alone. At least I'm still human. At least I'm still me. The radio in this motel room just turned itself on. Through the static, I can hear a voice that sounds like Thomas Brennan, calling coordinates that would lead me to a mine I haven't visited yet. The numbers are burned into my memory before I can turn the radio off. I'm packing my bag now. Time to move again. But if you're reading this, if you've found this account somewhere online or printed out in some archive, let it serve as a warning. If you ever receive an anonymous email with coordinates to abandoned mines. If you ever feel the compulsion to explore places where people have disappeared, if you ever hear voices calling your name from deep underground, don't follow them. Some trails are meant to lead you away from everything you've ever known, and not all transformations are improvements on what you were before. Drive past those coordinates. Delete those emails. Turn off the radio when it starts broadcasting numbers through the static. Whatever you do, don't go deeper. They're waiting for you down there, and they have all the time in the world.